"Well then, play us something," the host's voice boomed, louder than laughter and clinking glasses, "so we can at least have a laugh." The maid, Evelyn, lifted her gaze. Mr. Stallman's face radiated a smug delight, the kind of smile worn by a man who viewed every life around him as just another instrument for his amusement. Behind him, guests formed a semicircle. Men in tailcoats, women in velvet gowns, pearls, polished shoes, drinks in hand, bathed in artificial light. They were waiting for farce. "Good evening, friends. Write in the comments what city or country you're watching from. Don't forget to subscribe and like the video." She slowly rose from the table by the wall, removed her delicate gloves, placed them on a tray, and walked toward the grand piano, as if it were part of the evening routine. But inside, something entirely different was beating, something invisible from the outside. "Well, mademoiselle," someone jeered, "show us your talent." None of them knew who she was, and that suited Evelyn just fine. For 2 years, she had hidden her name, her past, the hands capable of creating miracles. 2 years since she last played. The piano was black, lacquered, polished like a mirror. Her fingers touched the keys as if by accident. With a breath, Stallman, half turned, was already relishing the performance. He didn't recognize her, and that too was part of her plan. She began to play, not a cheerful melody, not a household waltz or a folksy dance, but Rachmaninoff's Second Concerto. The introduction was restrained and cold, like stepping into a snowy forest. At first, no one in the hall understood, but by the 5th second, silence fell, and by the 10th, tension. The hostess's lips trembled. An elderly Count Melner dropped his glass onto the parquet. The Minister of Defense's son stared at the piano like it was a tunnel, and the host, Stallman, frowned. Not because he recognized the music, but because there was something deeply personal in it. Too personal. He looked at her face and suddenly froze. Those eyes. Flashback. 6 years ago, the Vienna Conservatory. A small hall smelled of glue and old wood. A girl on stage played the same concerto. In the audience, a businessman, then still rising, just beginning to storm Europe's elite. He was in love, but not with the music, with the girl. Long lashes, slender fingers. She refused dinners, expensive gifts. He found a way to bypass consent. Through her professor, through a grant, through manipulation and deceit. That spring, she vanished. Newspapers wrote about a nervous breakdown. Then, silence. No more concerts. Evelyn's fingers glided across the keys, like each chord was pulling something from the depths. Rachmaninoff's anxious, surging theme grew like an approaching storm. Guests stood in confusion. No one dared interrupt. It was as if the music was now setting the world's order and rhythm. Stallman, lord of the mansion, stood with his hands clasped behind his back. His face lengthened. He tried to maintain his condescending mask, but it cracked like porcelain under boiling water. He suddenly realized he couldn't move, as if the music had paralyzed him. "But she's just a maid, right?" one guest whispered, clutching her clutch. "How does she know Rachmaninoff?" Another murmured, but Evelyn didn't hear them, or pretended not to. Inside her pulsed the years: humiliation, erasure, fear, silence, memory, and rage. She wasn't playing music. She was playing the truth. She once saw an ad: staff needed for country residents, housing provided, no experience required. She had smiled. She had experience. She had memory and a goal. She changed her name, haircut, erased her digital trace. She became a maid, patiently waited, like a spy behind enemy lines. Like an actress in rehearsal, the mansion was exactly the place where Stallman hosted his soirees for the elite with champagne and a performative disdain for the lower class. Servants in that house lived in silence, tiptoed, hid in shadows. But Evelyn listened, memorized, prepared for the night the piano would sound again. Pause, thin then, a voice. "Who are you?" It wasn't loud, but it was sharp. Fear and irritation laced it. It was Stallman. He stepped forward, but Evelyn was already beginning the second movement. The music came like a challenge, like a slap, like a confession, like a sentence. "Stop this," he said again, but no one heard him. Everyone heard only her. Gers froze above the keys. The hall was silent. Memory, Stallman remembered. The girl, the conservatory, the scandal with the professor who suddenly disappeared, the missing paperwork, the grant signed by him with strings attached. It had all been legal, almost. He had thought she'd never return, that he had broken her. And now she was here, and she was playing. She remembered the smell of tobacco and varnish, remembered how he held her hand too long, how he promised tours, how afterward she wasn't accepted to a single concert, how she stayed silent and vanished, and now she was here, and she remembered everything, and she played, and the people watched, listened, realized. This wasn't a performance, this was a trial, the audience, jury. Her fingers struck the final chord. Silence lasted a second, then another, then a third, and then someone began clapping, tentatively, awkwardly. But the applause grew. People didn't know why they were applauding, but it was the only way to escape the discomfort. Stallman stood in the shadows, staring at her, and for the first time in 10 years, he was afraid. After the performance, the guests didn't disperse. Everyone lingered near the buffet or the windows, as if waiting for something important. Whispered murmurs floated through the air like smoke from a thin cigar. No one said Evelyn's name out loud. Everyone avoided looking directly at her, as if by refusing to acknowledge her existence, everything would return to normal. She walked past them with a tray in hand as if nothing had happened. The tray trembled, but not from fear, rather from unrelenting focus. Stallman stood by the fireplace with a glass, but he didn't drink the wine. He watched her from the corner of his eye. "Where did you study?" one of the women asked with a strained smile. "With my grandmother," Evelyn answered calmly. "Your grandmother must have been a genius," the woman joked, but her laughter came out dry and brittle. Stallman stepped closer. "We need to talk," he said quietly, but with the same commanding tone he used to give orders. "I'm working," she replied without looking at him. "You—" He stopped mid-sentence. In his eyes was the realization, you remember everything. She turned away and walked down the corridor. He followed. On the staircase, where it was usually quiet, Stallman caught up to her. His cold hand gripped her wrist. "Why are you here?" "To play." "Don't lie, you didn't come for that." Evelyn looked at him calmly. "Have you ever heard what the truth sounds like?" He flinched. She continued, "Sometimes the truth sounds like a chord, or like the silence that follows it. Both are unbearable to those who are used to lies." He stood there, pale. She stepped down the stairs, leaving him in half shadow, with a glass he never drank from. The kitchen door slammed. Her fellow maid Rosa stood by the stove and looked at Evelyn in astonishment. You really played that? Who are you?" Evelyn smiled wearily. "Just someone who was silent for too long." Rosa wanted to ask more, but fell quiet. She felt that something had begun in this house, something bigger than a scandal, a wave, and it was already rising above the golden facade. The next morning, the house breathed with tense silence. Breakfast was served, as always, in the Eastern Hall, but there were fewer guests than usual. Some had left during the night, others refused to leave their rooms. The weather had sharply turned, grey skies, rain, slush. Everything looked as if even the atmosphere knew something had been broken. Stallman sat at the table, untouched food before him. A tablet lay nearby. He was scrolling through reports, the staff list, search engine queries. "Evelyn Hart, hired 3 months ago, no references, no file, nothing," he muttered. He tapped a contact, a private detective. "Find everything about her, everything, photos, relatives, where she lived, where she studied, fast." In that moment, he looked like a man who, for the first time in his life, had lost control. Memory. Evelyn. A small room at the Vienna Conservatory. Snowstorm outside the window, a letter on the piano, her first win, an invitation to an international competition in Paris. She trembled with joy. A knock on the door. Stallman entered, back then a patron of young talents. In his hands a box of chocolates and an envelope. "You're going, of course. I arranged everything." "Why are you doing this?" "Because you're brilliant, and because I can't not help." He smiled, and then, days later, her professor was dismissed. Her name vanished from the competition program. Within a month, no one cared about her anymore. She cried at night in the bathroom, then went silent, then disappeared. Evelyn flinched, returning to the present. Rosa poured tea but didn't meet her eyes. "He suspects something," she whispered. "He knows," Evelyn replied. "Are you afraid?" "I am, but now he's more afraid." That morning, Evelyn had a plan. She knew she didn't have much time. She pulled out an old flash drive. On it were letters, photos, audio recordings, years of collected evidence, everything she had prepared not for the authorities or the press, but for the people who heard her the night before. Because truth isn't just vengeance, it's a mirror everyone must look into. She sent the letter during the night, used an old anonymous email, and included a link to cloud storage with the files. "Well then, play us something," the host's voice boomed, louder than laughter and clinking glasses, "so we can at least have a laugh." The maid, Evelyn, lifted her gaze. Mr. Stallman's face radiated a smug delight, the kind of smile worn by a man who viewed every life around him as just another instrument for his amusement. Behind him, guests formed a semicircle. Men in tailcoats, women in velvet gowns, pearls, polished shoes, drinks in hand, bathed in artificial light. They were waiting for farce. "Good evening, friends. Write in the comments what city or country you're watching from. Don't forget to subscribe and like the video." She slowly rose from the table by the wall, removed her delicate gloves, placed them on a tray, and walked toward the grand piano, as if it were part of the evening routine. But inside something entirely different was beating, something invisible from the outside. "Well, mademoiselle," someone jeered, "show us your talent." None of them knew who she was, and that suited Evelyn just fine. For 2 years, she had hidden her name, her past, the hands capable of creating miracles. 2 years since she last played. The piano was black, lacquered, polished like a mirror. Her fingers touched the keys as if by accident. With a breath, Stallman, half-turned, was already relishing the performance. He didn't recognize her, and that too was part of her plan. She began to play, not a cheerful melody, not a household waltz or a folksy dance, but Rachmaninoff's Second Concerto. The introduction was restrained and cold, like stepping into a snowy forest. At first, no one in the hall understood, but by the 5th second, silence fell, and by the 10th, tension. The hostess's lips trembled. An elderly Count Melner dropped his glass onto the parquet. The Minister of Defense's son stared at the piano like it was a tunnel, and the host, Stallman, frowned. Not because he recognized the music, but because there was something deeply personal in it. Too personal. He looked at her face and suddenly froze. Those eyes. Flashback. 6 years ago, the Vienna Conservatory. A small hall smelled of glue and old wood. A girl on stage played the same concerto. In the audience, a businessman, then still rising, just beginning to storm Europe's elite. He was in love, but not with the music, with the girl. Long lashes, slender fingers. She refused dinners, expensive gifts. He found a way to bypass consent. Through her professor, through a grant, through manipulation and deceit. That spring, she vanished. Newspapers wrote about a nervous breakdown. Then, silence. No more concerts. Evelyn's fingers glided across the keys, like each chord was pulling something from the depths. Rachmaninoff's anxious, surging theme grew like an approaching storm. Guests stood in confusion. No one dared interrupt. It was as if the music was now setting the world's order and rhythm. Stallman, lord of the mansion, stood with his hands clasped behind his back. His face lengthened. He tried to maintain his condescending mask, but it cracked like porcelain under boiling water. He suddenly realized he couldn't move, as if the music had paralyzed him. But she's just a maid, right? One guest whispered, clutching her clutch. How does she know Rachmaninoff? Another murmured, but Evelyn didn't hear them or pretended not to. Inside her pulsed the years: humiliation, erasure, fear, silence, memory, and rage. She wasn't playing music. She was playing the truth. She once saw an ad: staff needed for country residents, housing provided, no experience required. She had smiled. She had experience. She had memory and a goal. She changed her name, haircut, erased her digital trace. She became a maid, patiently waited, like a spy behind enemy lines. Like an actress in rehearsal, the mansion was exactly the place where Stallman hosted his soirees for the elite, with champagne and a performative disdain for the lower class. Servants in that house lived in silence, tiptoed, hid in shadows. But Evelyn listened, memorized, prepared for the night the piano would sound again. Pause, fin then, a voice. "Who are you?" It wasn't loud, but it was sharp. Fear and irritation laced it. It was Stallman. He stepped forward, but Evelyn was already beginning the second movement. The music came like a challenge, like a slap, like a confession, like a sentence. "Stop this," he said again, but no one heard him. Everyone heard only her. Girls froze above the keys. The hall was silent. Memory, Stallman remembered. The girl, the conservatory, the scandal with the professor who suddenly disappeared, the missing paperwork, the grant signed by him with strings attached. It had all been legal, almost. He had thought she'd never return, that he had broken her. And now she was here, and she was playing. She remembered the smell of tobacco and varnish, remembered how he held her hand too long, how he promised tours, how afterward she wasn't accepted to a single concert. No one was speaking in full voice yet, but the anticipation hung thick, brittle, like glass waiting to shatter. The heavy oak doors of the club swung open. Out stepped Stallman. Grey wool coat buttoned to the neck, umbrella held by an assistant, a faint frown between his brows as if the cold had inconvenienced him. Flashbulbs popped instantly. Reporters surged forward. "Mr. Stallman, did you know Evelyn Hart's age at the time of your sponsorship? Is it true her professor disappeared under suspicious circumstances? Do you deny knowing about the other women involved?" Stallman didn't answer. His expression didn't shift, not immediately. He kept walking, flanked by 2 aides and a bodyguard, but the questions came like a hailstorm. Why did Evelyn Hart leave the conservatory? Why was she removed from the Paris competition roster? Are you aware your name is mentioned in multiple anonymous testimonies? Did you threaten the families of your protégés? A final voice, louder than the others, raw with anger and disbelief. "Bring out Evelyn!" That stopped him. Not physically. He didn't freeze, but his eyes flickered just for a moment, and in that moment he was no longer the unshakable mogul. Something cracked behind his composed mask. A muscle in his jaw trembled, and then something unexpected. Applause. It started from somewhere behind the reporters, then another and another. A ripple of sound that turned the crowd, disoriented, into an audience. They weren't clapping for him. They were clapping for the woman he had underestimated. Everything had changed. The power that had always hovered around Stallman like a private storm had shifted direction. Now it hung in the air, raw and untamed, circling someone else. Someone not even present. At that very moment, in a modest hotel on the outskirts of the city, Evelyn Hart sat cross-legged on a bed with rumpled white sheets, a cup of bitter black tea cooling in her hand. Her laptop glowed softly beside her. On screen, an email with a gold emblem in the header, a signature from the Leipzig Philharmonic Orchestra, and one line that made her lips curve slightly. "We would be honored to host your solo performance. No obligations, just your music." She reread it, not to confirm the words but to feel them. This wasn't triumph, not the kind she'd fantasized about in her darkest moments. This was something deeper, restoration, not of fame or applause, but of truth and of identity, of breath. She looked out the rain-streaked window. Below, the city bus stopped at a light. Life moved forward, and so would she. Because this wasn't over. This was the final act. A week later, the courtroom was packed. The early hearings were supposed to be procedural, focused only on financial inconsistencies in Stallman's business ventures. But the public didn't care about numbers. They cared about names, faces. Silence turned to testimony. Every morning, journalists arrived before sunrise. Lines formed outside the courthouse. Students with printed screenshots of Evelyn's performance. Activists with signs, "We believe the music. Truth needs no encore. Silence is complicity." Inside, Stallman sat on the defendant's bench like a man who had stepped into a version of his life he didn't recognize. His once impenetrable composure was wearing thin. His mouth was pressed into a hard, colorless line. His lawyers whispered urgently beside him. They looked like wolves who'd lost the scent. Across from them, the witnesses took the stand. One by one. Not all were victims. Some were former employees, some were journalists who had chased old rumors but found closed doors. Some were musicians who had watched girls disappear from competitions and assumed the worst, but never spoke. Now they spoke, and in every testimony, even when her name was not uttered, there was her presence. Evelyn Hart, the woman in the black dress, the fingers on the keys, the truth inside the music, but she wasn't there. She never entered the courtroom. Her name lived only in the mouths of others, but in their words, it moved like melody, sharp, unrelenting, echoing through the marble hallways and carved columns like the ghost of a forgotten concerto. The night before the concert in Leipzig, Evelyn stood alone on the stage of the city's famed Philharmonic Hall. It was empty, no orchestra, no audience, just her. She walked across the wood boards in silence, touched the edge of the grand piano, lifted the cover. She sat, ran her hand gently over the keys. They were warm from the technician's recent tuning. She pressed a single note, then another, then a phrase, the first movement, and as the notes rose into the high ceiling of the concert hall, a deep breath moved through her chest, steady, measured, like a metronome. She was ready. Backstage, a man watched her from the wings. The concert producer, a tall man with thinning hair and quiet shoes. He approached after she finished the passage, removed his hat. His voice was low. "You know this isn't just a concert tonight." She nodded once. "This is the finale," he said. "Everything you've done, everyone who listened. It's all built to this moment. The world will be watching. Are you afraid?" She turned to him, calm. "I was afraid of silence," she said, "not of the truth." That evening the Leipzig Philharmonic glowed with golden light. Outside, the line wrapped around the block. The concert was free, but every seat was taken. The ushers had run out of programs. People shared them in folded halves. No one spoke above a whisper. Inside, the orchestra was already seated, tuned, prepared. The conductor stood tall, bathed in white overhead light. The acoustics were so perfect, one could hear a cough from the second balcony, the shifting of a shoe from the first row. And then Evelyn walked on stage. The applause was immediate, but not thunderous. It wasn't that kind. It was like a rising tide. Gentle, then crashing. She wore a black dress. Simple, no embellishments. Her hair was pulled back, no jewelry, no makeup. She was no longer the maid. She was no longer the forgotten girl. She was just a woman. And her music, she bowed briefly, sat at the grand piano, took one breath, and began. First, a piece by Schubert. It was short, gentle, like a soft sigh after tears. The melody was fragile, trembling, but clear. The audience sat in stillness, no rustling, no movement. Then came Debussy, fractured notes like reflections in water, each phrase shimmering, unstable, memories without words. Then Ravel, and then a pause, a breath. She glanced toward the conductor, who gave her a nod, and Evelyn began the second piano concerto by Rachmaninoff. Again, the same piece, the one that had shattered the silence in Stallman's manner. But now it wasn't a challenge, it wasn't a weapon, it wasn't revenge, it was forgiveness to herself, to those who had watched and said nothing, to those who had once listened and now finally heard. The hall did not breathe. People wept. Some closed their eyes. Some held their hands to their chests. One woman silently clutched her handkerchief and trembled. When the final chord struck, there was no applause, only silence, that eternal, sacred moment after the music ends and before life returns. And then, applause, not polite, not required. It rolled through the hall like thunder through a valley. Some stood, some sobbed. All knew something had changed, not just for Evelyn, for all of them. Backstage, the producer stood waiting. He said nothing for a long time, just looked at her, then finally, "You just did more than all the tribunals in the world. They heard you." Evelyn smiled, exhausted. The applause echoed long after Evelyn had left the stage. In the foyer of the Leipzig Philharmonic, audience members lingered as if unable or unwilling to return to their normal lives. They stood in clusters, whispering, not with excitement, but reverence. Some stared at the high ceilings, others simply listened to the phantom trace of Rachmaninoff still vibrating in their bones. They hadn't just attended a concert, they had witnessed something holy, something that blurred the line between art and reckoning. Backstage, Evelyn sat alone in the green room. A low table beside her held a glass of water and a single folded program. Her fingers rested in her lap, trembling now, not from nerves, but from release. For years, her body had carried tension like armor. It had protected her through silence, through servitude, through every dinner she served in heels too tight and silence too loud. And now that armor was falling away. She looked down at her hands. Those same hands that had once played before kings and critics, that had then scrubbed floors, carried trays, and gone ignored in fine estates. Tonight, those hands had spoken louder than words ever could. The door opened gently. The producer entered carrying his overcoat. His eyes were soft. "We've had 3 standing ovations before intermission," he said. 3, and people are still clapping out there. Evelyn didn't respond. She simply nodded once, grateful. He looked at her, uncertain, then quietly, "Do you want to be alone?" She gave a tired smile. "I already was." For years he understood. He closed the door quietly behind him. The next morning, social media was on fire. Clips from the concert spread like sparks from a wildfire. A 30-second video of the encore alone passed 1 million views by midday. Comments flooded in from every corner of the globe. "I don't understand classical music, but I cried watching this." "Her hands don't play, they confess." "She didn't just perform, she exposed something."
The hashtags began to trend. Evelyn Hart, Waikiri, The Silent Concerto, Bach, Truth in Music, Arte and Justice, Through Art. Major networks scrambled to get rights to the full concert recording. Requests poured into Evelyn's email. Interviews, festival invitations, invitations to conservatories that had once erased her name. But she answered none of them. Instead, she closed her laptop, made herself a cup of tea, and returned to her modest hotel window, watching the city breathe. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was chasing something. She wasn't hiding either. She was simply existing. It was enough. But it wouldn't be for long, because the next phase had already begun. Across town, Stallman's estate was no longer the fortress of confidence it had once been. The marble floors still gleamed. The gold-accented mirrors still reflected pristine wealth. But the people who walked through the corridors did so quietly, nervously. The staff whispered in corners. Every knock at the door was followed by an anxious glance. In his office, Stallman sat behind his desk, his tie undone, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. The curtains were drawn despite the morning sun. He was not reading news reports. He was scanning transcripts, statements, depositions, his private detective's findings. Every mention of Evelyn's name felt like a needle under his fingernails. The screen in front of him showed footage from the concert. The feed had been pulled from a private source. He had watched it once. Then again. Then again. Not to admire, but to analyze, to decipher, to try to understand how she had done it. How a servant had crossed the threshold between obscurity and legend without his permission. His empire was built on control, silence, influence. But Evelyn hadn't just broken the rules. She had rewritten them, without asking. His phone buzzed. It was the chairman of the European Business Forum. He let it ring. He already knew what it would be: distancing, withdrawals, polite severances dressed as review periods. His lawyer had already warned him. The testimonies were becoming hard to contain. New witnesses were coming forward. A formal criminal investigation was being considered, not just into financial abuse, but personal misconduct. The empire was cracking, and at the center of the fault line, her. Meanwhile, Evelyn, still in Leipzig, opened the drawer of her hotel nightstand. Inside, nestled between notebooks and worn concert programs, was the second flash drive. Small, silver, seemingly insignificant. But it held more than her story. It held theirs. Over the years, she had gathered fragments from others: maids, assistants, students, girls who had brushed against Stallman's world and walked away bruised. Some had spoken openly. Others had whispered. Some had cried through closed doors. Evelyn had collected their truths in silence, waiting for the moment they might matter. Now, they did. She powered up her laptop. She opened a private browser, logged into a secured, anonymous email account. Attached the contents of the flash drive to 5 new emails, each addressed to prominent figures: a human rights lawyer in Berlin, an investigative journalist in Paris, a whistleblower forum in Brussels, a cultural ombudsman in Vienna, and a former music competition judge now turned advocate. Each message contained the same sentence: "This is not just about me. It never was. You know what to do." She hovered over the send button. Her fingers hesitated, then clicked. By the following afternoon, the internet was a wildfire. The contents of the second flash drive were explosive. Not rumors. Documents. Audio. Photos. Emails. Timelines. Voicemails from frightened students. Screenshots of canceled auditions. Emails from Stallman's assistants offering favors in exchange for silence. Even a blurry, damning photo from the backstage of a conservatory gala showing Stallman with his hand placed just a little too long on a girl's shoulder, her eyes wide, his smile performative. It wasn't one story anymore. It was a system. And the headlines reflected that. Cultural titan or predator? Inside the world of Gustav Stallman, new documents expose pattern of exploitation in elite music circles. Voices rise against silence. Evelyn Hart's legacy spurs global reckoning. It was no longer about a single maid who played piano. It was about an entire culture of complicity. In Stallman's study, the silence was suffocating. He sat motionless, his hands gripping the edge of his chair. The TV on the wall was muted, but the scrolling captions screamed louder than sound. Stallman faces international inquiry. Leaked emails suggest pattern of abuse. Dozens come forward. His lawyer's voice was hoarse from overnight calls. Damage control is no longer viable, he said. We need to shift to defense. Serious defense. Stallman said nothing. His face was pale. His fingers twitched against the mahogany armrest.
He looked like a man who'd climbed a mountain only to find it collapsing beneath him. In a moment of frustration, he hurled a crystal decanter across the room. It shattered against a wall. The whiskey inside splashed across a family portrait. He stared at it, then turned to his assistant. "Where is she?" The assistant didn't respond immediately. Stallman's voice turned to ice. "Where is Evelyn Hart?" "She left Leipzig this morning," the assistant said. "No press. No statement. She's gone." "Find her," Stallman snapped. "I want to speak to her." But Evelyn had no interest in speaking to him. She wasn't hiding. She was healing. Back in Vienna, she checked into a modest apartment she hadn't visited in years. Her fingers ran across the chipped windowsill, the old upright piano in the corner, the familiar kettle still on the stove. This had once been her prison. Now it was her sanctuary. She made tea, lit a candle, sat at the piano, and played, not for anyone else, just for herself. Outside her window the world churned. News vans drove past. Reporters knocked on neighbors' doors. Fans left folded letters beneath the building's front step, but Evelyn didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her truth had already been heard. And now it was the world's turn to speak. The storm didn't break with thunder or rain. It came in silence. Legal language, sealed documents, subpoenas, and anonymous testimony made public. It was Wednesday when the first charges were officially filed. Financial misconduct, abuse of influence, witness intimidation, tampering with academic records. The Austrian National Prosecutor's Office released a statement that included words never before attached to Gustav Stallman's name: under investigation, suspected exploitation, institutional corruption. The words cracked like ice beneath his empire. From his penthouse office high above Vienna's financial district, Stallman watched as the news unfolded in real time. Monitors flickered with headlines. Emails arrived like pounding fists on a locked door. Phone calls went unanswered. He was no longer in control of the narrative, and worse, he knew it. His executive assistant entered the room with trembling hands. "Sir," she began softly, "the Philharmonic Board just suspended your honorary membership." Stallman didn't look up. He simply nodded once, slowly. The screen in front of him still displayed the photo of Evelyn Hart at the piano, head bowed in reverence over the keys. That image had become a symbol. She was no longer a woman to the world, she was a movement, a reckoning. Back in her quiet flat, Evelyn stood in the morning light, staring at her own reflection in the window pane. Vienna buzzed beneath her feet, but she stayed still. In her hands was a letter, not an email, not a text, a real letter, mailed without return address, written in precise cursive ink. Inside, "If you've forgiven the world, forgive me too. Or at least, tell me how to forgive myself." No signature, no name, but she didn't need one. It was his handwriting. She folded the paper gently and set it on the piano. Just above middle C, she wouldn't reply. She didn't owe him that. Forgiveness wasn't a coin to be flipped. It was something earned in absence, in the long, painful quiet after everything breaks. She opened the window and let the wind carry in the sounds of a city waking to a new day. A city that was finally listening. In the weeks that followed the Leipzig concert, more testimonies surfaced. Not just in Austria, not just in Europe, everywhere. Former protégés in the US, Canada, South Korea, France. Girls who had once been pushed off stage, off programs, off their futures, began speaking, some through lawyers, some through music. One girl, 19 years old, released a cello solo titled Requiem for the Silenced that became viral in 3 hours. It was no longer a scandal, it was a movement. Music had never been this political or this personal. And at the center of it all, Evelyn Hart refused to be famous. She declined interviews, ignored brand offers, turned down a book deal with a 6-figure advance. Instead, she performed at small charity concerts, quietly visited old teachers, reconnected with the family of her childhood piano instructor who had died during the years of her disappearance. She reclaimed her name not with fanfare, but with integrity, and the world loved her all the more for it. Meanwhile, Stallman's lawyers were drowning. One by one, his former allies withdrew support. Board positions were frozen, bank accounts examined. Institutions he had once helped build were now erasing his plaques, removing his portraits, freezing his access. A global business summit removed him from their invitation list, publicly. A prominent conservatory rescinded the auditorium bearing his name. Even the family-owned estate in the Austrian countryside, where once champagne flowed like water and artists' mirrors.
Under chandeliers now stood empty. Windows shuttered. Silence thicker than velvet. And still, he refused to disappear. One day, he summoned his PR team for a single, damning request. "I want to do an interview," he said. They looked at him like he had lost his mind. "With who?" his head of communications asked. He lifted his glass of scotch. "Everyone." The backlash was immediate. The interview, as it came to be known, aired live across multiple networks. Stallman, dressed in a navy suit, sat across from a seasoned female journalist in a sparsely decorated studio. The cameras rolled. The world tuned in, and the interview began. It was clear from the first moment. He wasn't here to apologize. He was here to reclaim his version of the truth. "I have mentored dozens of young artists," he said, voice level. "Have I made mistakes? Perhaps. But I have never knowingly harmed anyone." The journalist was sharp. "There are signed documents, audio recordings, taken out of context," he countered. "Twisted. What people don't realize is that genius attracts envy. And sometimes people rewrite history when the music no longer suits them." When Evelyn's name came up, he stiffened. She was brilliant, he admitted, but fragile. She misunderstood a great deal. The journalist tilted her head. "She accused you of manipulating her career." "She disappeared," he said. "I looked for her. I even offered help. She refused." "You offered help?" the journalist repeated, "after a scandal forced her off stage and out of a conservatory?" His jaw tightened. "She was not the only one facing pressure. I was a public figure. I had to protect others. The narrative being pushed now? It's convenient, not complete." The interview ended. Public reaction was volcanic. Social media exploded with anger. Hashtags turned brutal. "He still doesn't get it. Not sorry. Just caught your gaslight concerto." But the worst part wasn't what he said. It was what he didn't say. Not once did he express empathy. Not once did he look at the camera and acknowledge what had happened to those girls, to Evelyn. That silence, that final refusal, it echoed louder than any confession. And Evelyn? She watched the interview in full, then closed the laptop, then turned to the piano, and played for 2 hours alone in the dim light until the sun rose again. Elsewhere in the city, Evelyn's former colleague, Rosa, the maid from the estate, watched from her tiny kitchen. She had once feared Stallman, had tiptoed past him in the halls, had bowed her head and learned silence as survival. Now she watched his interview and laughed. Not from amusement, from the absurdity of a man still believing his power lived in the sound of his own voice. She stood, pulled out her old notebook, the one she had kept hidden in the bottom of a drawer, and she began to write. Her memories, her witness account, her part of the story. Evelyn had started a fire. Now others would carry the torch. 3 months later, a grand jury convened in Vienna. Formal charges were announced. The most serious, systematic abuse of power across cultural and educational institutions. If convicted, Gustav Stallman could face up to 25 years in prison. The courtroom overflowed with journalists, activists, former students. The judge's gavel echoed like a starting pistol. Outside the courthouse, musicians gathered and played Rachmaninoff, not in defiance, but in mourning for the art that had once been used as a cage, and for the artist who had turned it into a sword. Evelyn did not attend. She was in a small village near the Alps, living with a retired violinist couple who had once mentored her as a teenager. She helped in the garden. She walked along the river. She wrote music. But she didn't disappear. Every few weeks, she uploaded a short video. Just her. A piano. One piece. No explanation. No monetization. No ads. Just music. The world watched in silence, and the silence became something sacred. And still, every now and then, another letter would arrive. Handwritten. No name, no request for reply. Just sentences like, "The house is empty now. The boardroom seats are vacant. Do you ever dream about the recital hall? I heard your last piece. You haven't lost your edge." Each note was a ghost, a man trying to find his way out of the wreckage he created. She never answered. But she read everyone. Not to revisit the past, but to remind herself, she won. The courtroom was cold, not from lack of heat, but from tension thick enough to turn breath into frost. Gustav Stahlmann sat motionless at the defense table, his shoulders hunched forward, the sharp lines of his once pristine suits now sagging with the weight of irrelevance. His jaw was clenched, his gaze fixed on the wall ahead, where a projection screen displayed Exhibit 42, a grainy video of a 16-year-old pianist auditioning in Vienna's youth conservatory.
In the corner of the video, his voice commenting on the girl's emotional instability, suggesting she be redirected toward academic pursuits. In the audience that day, off-camera, sat Evelyn Hart. The prosecutor's voice cut through the courtroom like a violin string pulled taut. You weren't just denying her future, Herr Stahlmann. You were erasing it. He didn't reply, because for once he couldn't. Across the city, in a quiet music school in Vienna's Margaretten district, Evelyn stood before a dozen teenagers. She wasn't there to perform. She had been invited, against her own instincts, to teach a master class. It wasn't a publicized event. No cameras, no press. Just students, worn keys, and sunlight cutting across the old wooden floors. One boy, barely 13, asked her gently, "Did you ever want to stop playing?" After everything? Evelyn thought for a moment, then said softly, "I didn't stop playing. I just stopped being heard." The boy nodded, not entirely understanding, but recognizing something honest in her voice. The lesson continued. She spoke not of fame or perfection. She spoke of silence, of what it meant to live in rooms where your sound didn't matter, and how every note you play is a reclaiming of space. Every hand raised to play that day trembled a little less. Meanwhile, the trial continued, and witnesses poured in. A former assistant recounted late-night meetings behind locked doors. A student testified to lost opportunities, letters of recommendation that vanished without reason. Even a former dean confessed, "We were afraid of losing funding. We knew something was wrong. We stayed quiet." Every testimony added another note to the growing requiem of Stahlmann's legacy. He didn't speak, not once. His lawyers advised silence, not out of strategy, but survival. Outside the courthouse, protesters held signs, "Silence is complicity. We are all Evelyn Hart. Let the music testify." And inside the hearts of many who had never played a note, something shifted. Because Evelyn's story was not just about music. It was about power, about voice, and about what happens when the quiet refuse to stay quiet any longer. In the evenings, Evelyn returned to her small apartment above a cafe. The owners were an elderly couple who left her fresh bread at her door every morning and asked no questions. She liked it that way. Her window overlooked a narrow street filled with violins and bicycles. Every night after tea, she sat at the piano. She didn't always play. Sometimes she just rested her fingers there, breathing in the quiet, listening, remembering. One night a letter arrived. It was different. Typed, not handwritten. The return address was from Leipzig's City Cultural Office. Inside, "We are honored to invite you to curate a new music program in partnership with the Philharmonic, focusing on recovery, resilience, and rediscovery. A space not just for performance, but for those whose stories were never told. We will follow your lead." She read it twice, then again, then folded it slowly. It wasn't a triumph, but it was trust, and trust meant beginning again. The next day, she boarded the train. No entourage, no announcement. She arrived in Leipzig under soft grey skies, a light rain misting the city's tram lines. She walked to the Philharmonic alone. A staff member recognized her, stopped her. "Frau Hart, may I say what you've done? It's changed everything." Evelyn nodded once. "I hope it changes more than just everything." They smiled, not fully understanding what she meant. Because Evelyn no longer saw change as headlines. She saw it in rooms, in silences, in second chances. The rehearsal hall was empty when she entered. Dust motes floated in the air like old applause. She approached the piano in the center. Its lid was already open, placed her hands gently on the keys, and began to play Debussy, soft, blurred, and full of shadows. It wasn't about precision, it was about recovery. That evening, an invitation was sent out to hundreds of musicians, students, and cultural workers across Europe. A new program was forming, the Heart Fellowship, dedicated to unearthing lost talent, a place for those once silenced, a stage for those who never got to finish their first song, funded anonymously, but everyone knew. Meanwhile, in court, the verdict came closer. Stallman's final defense fell flat. The documents were real, the testimonies consistent, the narrative now public, and in the judge's eyes no longer just an accusation, but the truth carried by hundreds. Sentencing was postponed, but his guilt had already crystallized. He would not return to polite society, he would not be forgotten, but he would be remembered for what he tried to bury. That night, Evelyn returned to her apartment and found another letter under her door, typed short. She sat. "I've watched your rehearsal today. Thank you for playing Debussy. That was our piece once." No name, she didn't tear it up. She didn't keep it either. She let the wind take it as she walked to her balcony and watched the city blink alive below her. She didn't need to answer anymore. The music had already done it. Days passed, weeks. Evelyn began to travel, not for fame, not for stages, for rooms, old rehearsal spaces in Poland, a half-collapsed school in Ukraine, a rebuilt conservatory in Sarajevo. She sat with students who had lost teachers, with teachers who had lost students, with women who had lost names. She didn't speak about Stallman. She didn't need to. They knew. She spoke about persistence, practice, pulse, because the truth didn't need repeating anymore. It needed continuing. One day she was asked, "What do you want your legacy to be?" Evelyn paused, then replied, "I don't want a legacy. I want a ripple." She pressed her hand to the piano. And ripples don't carry names. They carry movement. By the time the official verdict came, the world had already moved with her. Gustav Stallman was sentenced to 12 years for obstruction, tampering, and abuse of position. The harsher charges, still under appeal, would follow. But his name was no longer engraved in marble. It was etched in warning, in schools, in books, in workshops that bore new names. And at the opening of the first Heart Program Gala, students from 8 countries performed a concert composed entirely by survivors. The final piece, a new symphony, written by a collaboration of 12 unknown artists, inspired by one pianist's silence and her return. And in the final note, there was no triumph, just truth, which perhaps was louder and longer. The ripple did not crash like a wave. It moved slowly, deliberately, through conversations, conservatories, classrooms, and corridors of power. It shifted how auditions were held, how recommendations were written, how silence was interpreted. Evelyn Hart's name no longer existed in a parenthesis. She was now part of policy. Her testimony, though never publicly read, had informed changes at the European Arts Accreditation Council. Funding boards introduced new oversight. Committees welcomed students as voting members. And in every interview about the reforms, a journalist inevitably asked, would this have happened without Evelyn Hart? The answer, every time, no. But Evelyn was not in Brussels or Paris or Berlin. She was in Graz, in a community center turned music space, teaching a group of migrant children whose families had fled war. The room had no stage, just plastic chairs, cracked mirrors, and a single out-of-tune upright piano. Yet the music that emerged, raw, uneven, full of clashing rhythms and hope, moved her in a way no grand hall ever had. After class, a small girl with a chipped violin walked up and whispered, "My mom says you're famous." Evelyn knelt. "That's just a word. I'm still learning, like you." The girl smiled, then handed her a folded piece of paper. A drawing, stick figures on a stage, one at the piano. The caption read, "She sings without voice." Evelyn kept it, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. Back in Vienna, Rosa, the former maid of Stallman's estate, published an article, "What the Walls Heard." A first-person piece recounting not only what she witnessed, but what she felt. Her account went viral. It wasn't about revenge. It was about humanity. About noticing the small ways control is enforced, the dinners where no one looked at the staff, the pianos covered in cloth, the guests who whispered names like insults. Rosa's writing landed her a job as a researcher for a documentary team investigating cultural silencing across elite institutions. For the first time in her life, she was being asked, not ordered. She often thought of Evelyn during long editing sessions, and once, late at night, she sent a message. "You taught me to listen to my own voice. I hope you're still listening to yours." Evelyn replied just once, "Always." Meanwhile, Gustav Stallman was moved to a minimum security facility in Lower Austria. He was allowed books, daily walks, even a piano in the communal room. He rarely played. When he did, it was mechanical, cold. He had been stripped of his networks, his immunity, his shadow leverage, and in their place, silence. The silence he once forced onto others now echoed back in his own cell. He received letters, some angry, some forgiving. He read them all. One came without a return address. Inside was a single line. "Some prisons don't have bars. You built yours note by note." He crumpled the letter, but didn't throw it away. Fan applause. He tucked it into a book of Debussy preludes. He couldn't explain why. Months passed. The Heart Fellowship gained momentum. Applications flooded in from Nepal, Mexico, Georgia, Brazil. Musicians who had quit. Teachers who had been dismissed. Parents advocating for daughters who had been ignored. The fellowship expanded. From Leipzig to Lisbon. From Prague to Manila. And at the heart of it all, a principle Evelyn insisted on. No one performs alone. Every concert featured duets, ensembles, collaborations. Music, she said, was a conversation, not a spotlight. And it was in one of those conversations that Evelyn met Samuel Asare, a Ghanaian violinist who had spent 6 years playing underground in refugee shelters across Europe. He didn't know her story. She didn't know his, but they played together, first cautiously, then wildly. In him, Evelyn found something she hadn't felt in years, trust without history. They played Schumann at dusk in an open square in Porto. People stopped, watched, cried. And when they were done, Samuel turned to her and said simply, "You're more than what happened to you." She didn't reply, but she kept playing. And the next morning, they shared coffee and silence in a cafe that smelled of cinnamon and sea air. But not all was calm. At a press conference in Salzburg, a prominent critic, an old friend of Stallman's, publicly dismissed the Heart movement as emotional sensationalism. "Music must be judged on skill," he said, "not story." The backlash was immediate. Dozens of students walked out of his lecture the next day. Petitions called for his removal. But Evelyn? She said nothing, because she knew backlash meant progress was real. The old world was trying to protect itself, but the tide had turned, and no lecture could unring the bell. In London, a major network aired a feature titled "The Girl at the Piano, The Story of Evelyn Hart." Evelyn had declined to participate. The producers had respected that, but they compiled interviews with friends, old instructors, and even Rosa. Footage of her playing in Leipzig opened the segment, and for a full 3 minutes the world watched Evelyn. No narration, no cuts, just her and Rachmaninoff. The silence afterward was more powerful than words. She received thousands of messages, not fan mail, but stories. A young dancer returning to her craft after abuse. A composer who had burned every piece she wrote, now writing again. A father who apologized to his daughter for doubting her. The ripples had reached the shore. But even in this rising tide, Evelyn remained grounded. She kept her flat in Vienna, still shopped at the corner bakery, still read poetry at night instead of checking trends, and every Sunday she played for the children at the community shelter. No cameras, no stage, just small hands, big eyes, and music. One evening a little boy asked, "Are you magic?" She smiled. "No," she said. I just remembered who I was. One day, while visiting a coastal town in Italy for a workshop, she passed a music store. In the window, an old upright piano for sale, weathered wood, yellowing keys. She walked in, tried a single chord. It was off-key, crooked, beautiful. She bought it, had it shipped back to Vienna. And in her flat, where once there had been only one piano, now stood two. The new one to teach, the old one to remember. That winter, the Austrian government held a national arts conference. Evelyn was invited to deliver the keynote address. She declined, but she sent a letter. It was read aloud on stage by a young student. To those who think the story is over, it isn't. Because every silence broken reveals another waiting behind it. Don't wait for applause, don't perform to be seen, play, speak, teach for those still afraid. Because music is not just what we hear, it's who we become after listening. The audience rose in silence, not in celebration, in recognition. Later that night, Evelyn lit a candle, placed it beside the piano, opened her notebook, and began writing a new piece. It had no title, no plan, just a rhythm she couldn't ignore. And as her hand moved across the page, she knew this was no longer a story about the past, it was a story becoming a future, one note at a time. Snow fell lightly over Vienna, muffling the sounds of the city, as if the sky itself had asked for quiet. Evelyn sat on the windowsill of her apartment, legs curled, a blanket over her shoulders, a mug of steaming tea beside her. Below, the street lamps painted golden puddles on the cobblestones. Her fingers traced the glass absently. She hadn't touched a piano in 3 days, not out of weariness, out of saturation. Too many hands had reached for her recently. Grants, interviews, concerts, dedications, exposés, lectures, memoir offers. Everyone wanted her to be something, a face, a name, a banner. And Evelyn? She had always just wanted to play. Downstairs, the old cafe owner, Herr Schneider, saw her silhouette through the upstairs window and shook his head with a fond smile. "She's thinking again," he told his wife. "Let her. Thinking is better than being chased," she said, pouring hot milk into a pot. But Evelyn wasn't just thinking. She was waiting for the feeling that told her what came next. It came the next morning, not with sound, but with silence. A letter, handwritten, no return address. "You don't know me, but I was at your concert in Leipzig. I brought my daughter. She hasn't spoken in over a year since the trial. That night after your final note, she leaned toward me and whispered, 'I want to play again. Thank you for giving my child back to me.'" Evelyn folded the letter carefully. Then she picked up the phone and made a call. "Tell them I'll do the broadcast, but not from a stage." The next week, the largest public broadcaster in Europe aired an unexpected announcement. Evelyn Hart returns with a performance filmed not in a concert hall, but in the abandoned auditorium of her childhood school. No ads, no sponsors, just a single camera, and Evelyn walking through the dust of her past. The broadcast began with silence, then footsteps, then her voice, low and direct. "I was told that I should perform as a symbol, that people need heroes. But I am not here to be that. I am here to play, because someone somewhere needs to hear this, and they need to know you're not alone." She sat, breathed, then played. Not Rachmaninoff, not Debussy, but an original piece, unfinished, raw, and full of pauses. It sounded like grief, like healing, like starting again. The reaction was immediate. The video flooded platforms, but something had changed. This time the comments weren't about Evelyn, they were about viewers themselves. "I've never picked up a violin, but I feel seen. This music is what my silence sounds like." She didn't just survive, she built a doorway. And in the days that followed, more doorways opened. A university in Budapest launched the Heart Archive, a collection of testimonies, letters, recordings, journals, donated by those who had once been silenced in their musical careers. A conservatory in Chile changed its audition process to allow submissions without names attached to prevent bias. A youth center in Toronto painted its music room with a mural of Evelyn's hands, not her face, just the hands. And in Tokyo, an underground theater group staged a play called Rest Note, using her story as the structure for a wordless performance built entirely from movement and sound. But even as her influence spread, Evelyn stayed still. She declined all new performances, refused offers to host awards or join panels. She returned to her students, her coffee, her walks by the canal, and one evening, while helping a child rehearse scales, she asked gently, "Why do you think you get nervous before playing?" The girl shrugged. "Because they're watching." "Who are they?" She pointed toward the empty row of chairs. "Everyone." Evelyn paused, then turned over a cup, placed it on the chair. "Then let's play for the cup, not for them." The girl laughed and played better than she ever had. Elsewhere, in a prison facility far from city lights, Stallman sat in a small room alone, holding a newspaper. On the front page, "Hard performance reaches 20 million views." He read the article 3 times. His eyes stopped on one quote. "Evelyn Hart never asked to be remembered. That's why she'll never be forgotten." He set the paper down, stared at the blank wall, then opened his notebook and wrote just 3 words. She chose music. Meanwhile, Rosa, now working full-time on a docu-series about institutional silence, flew to Warsaw to interview former musicians blacklisted from national competitions. She met an old woman, once a rising composer, forced into factory work after rejecting a patron's advances. The woman held a yellowed page, a composition she had never shown anyone. "I want Evelyn to have this," she whispered. Rosa took it, heart full, and sent it with a letter. Evelyn framed it, not as decoration, but as testimony. Spring arrived in Vienna. Snow melted. Cafes reopened their patios. And for the first time in years, Evelyn hosted a concert herself. But it wasn't advertised. No press, just invitations sent to 100 people. Survivors, whistleblowers, teachers who lost jobs for speaking up, students who never got their audition. She called it Between Silence and Sound. The venue? A greenhouse. Plants hung from the ceiling. The smell of jasmine and soil filled the air. Light filtered through old glass panes. There was no stage, just a circle of chairs, and in the center, her piano. She entered to no applause, Saturday, and said, "This is not a concert. It's a memory we'll build together." Then she played. Piece after piece, none of them famous, some unfinished. One composed by the old woman in Warsaw, one by a child in Graz, each followed by silence, no clapping, just listening, real listening. After the final note, Evelyn stood and whispered, "Thank you for remembering with me." The room stayed still, then one by one people embraced, not her, each other. Later that night, Samuel found her sitting in the garden outside. He handed her a small box. Inside, a stone pendant carved with the Rest Note symbol. "For when you forget that you don't need to carry the melody alone." She looked up at him. "I don't know what's next. You don't need to." And for the first time in weeks, she exhaled without weight. That week, an idea bloomed. Not a program, not a brand. A space, a permanent space. A place without stages, without judges, without applause, where stories were played, not packaged, where silence was allowed, even honored. She made calls, letters, plans. Her old professor offered the land, a philanthropist offered the funds, anonymously. And within 6 months the foundation was laid for the Hart Institute for Sound and Silence, not a school, not a theater, something in between. Where silence wasn't absence, it was breath, and music wasn't escape, it was a return. As the falls rose, Evelyn often walked the unfinished halls at dusk. She'd run her hand along the brick and whisper names of those lost, those still waiting, those still afraid. She promised she'd hold space for them until they could hold it themselves. One morning, a delivery came. A box, inside, a single page, typed. "I used to think silence meant control. You taught me it can mean truth. I'm sorry I tried to bury yours. I see now it was stronger than me. G.S. Evelyn read it once, then set it on fire, not out of anger, out of finality, because forgiveness didn't always mean reply. Sometimes it just meant letting go. That night, as the city fell asleep, Evelyn sat at the piano. She played the first piece she ever learned, slowly, tenderly, like a prayer, and as the notes faded, she smiled. Because now, she was playing for no one, and that meant, finally, she was playing for herself. Rain tapped against the tall glass panes of the unfinished hall at the Hart Institute for Sound and Silence. Inside, Evelyn stood before the piano, not to play, but to listen. The room still smelled of plaster and sawdust, the air sharp with spring moisture. The builders had left hours ago. The hall was quiet now, but not empty. The silence felt intentional, as if the walls had already begun to remember. She closed her eyes and whispered, "Thank you for waiting." Then she opened the lid, placed her fingers gently on the keys, and didn't play. Earlier that week, an email had arrived from an unfamiliar sender. "We've reviewed the archival records at the Vienna Conservatory as part of our Reformation inquiry. There's a missing file, one we believe may belong to you. Would you be willing to retrieve it yourself?" It wasn't a demand. It was an invitation. Evelyn hesitated, because she knew what was inside. She took the train to Vienna, her coat wrapped tightly around her hands in her lap the entire time. The city hadn't changed, but she had. She walked the same streets that once made her feel small, this time with shoulders straight, steps measured. At the conservatory, she was escorted into the archives, a dim wood-paneled room that smelled like old ink and time. The archivist handed her a thin file, stamped with her name, Evelyn Hartmann. She sat alone, opened it. Inside, letters of recommendation never sent. Competition scores crossed out, a forged signature, a photo of her, age 17, in a rehearsal room, unaware of the camera, a memo between two administrators, remove from rotation, do not reassign, sensitive connection to donor. Evelyn stared at it all, breath steady. This wasn't a surprise, it was a confirmation. She took a breath, closed the file, and left it on the table. The past no longer needed reclaiming, it had already been rewritten, in sound. Outside, the spring wind was sharp. Evelyn pulled her coat tighter and began walking, and then, unexpectedly, she saw her. Professor Arendt, the first woman who had ever told her, "You don't owe anyone brilliance." She was older now, thinner, her cane tapping on the pavement, but her eyes still held fire. They embraced. No words, just time folding back into itself. They sat on a bench near the river. The professor looked at her carefully. "You still play like you're breathing for someone else," she said softly. Evelyn looked down. "Sometimes I forget how to stop." "Then let it go. Breathe for yourself." A pause. "And when you do, come back and tell me how it sounds." Back at the institute, the floors had been polished, the windows cleaned. The garden had begun to bloom. Clematis vines curled over the arches like music frozen in mid-air. That evening, Evelyn called Samuel. "I think I'm ready." "For what?" "For the piece I haven't written yet." Over the next few weeks, she disappeared from public view. No concerts, no interviews. She spent her days in a sunlit room with nothing but a notebook, a kettle, and silence. And at night, she wrote, not just music, letters, to people she never answered, to girls she never met, to the version of herself who had once believed silence was the only way to stay whole. She didn't send the letters. She folded them neatly and placed them in a small black box on the piano. One morning she added a final one, to Stallman. It read, "I no longer need you to hear the music, because I know I can play without your absence." Then she burned it, and when the flame went out, so did the last tether. The institute opened with no ribbon cutting, no sponsors, only an announcement posted on its door. "Sound is welcomed. Silence is protected. Come in when you're ready." People came, one by one. A former opera singer who hadn't sung since her trial. a teenage boy who played cello only in closets, a deaf girl who composed by vibration and light. Evelyn watched them, helped them, didn't lead them. She taught with gestures, not rules. And when someone asked her what genre they would be learning, she replied, "Yours." One night, Rosa arrived with a gift, a painting of Evelyn standing in the Leipzig Hall, hands above the keys, face unreadable. The caption, "Where Truth Begins." Evelyn accepted it quietly, but hung it in the bathroom, because she didn't need to see it every day. She was no longer becoming the truth. She was already living it. A year passed. The institute grew. Still no board, no logos, just people, and music, and memory, and choice. Then one day an invitation arrived from the Royal Concertgebouw in Amsterdam, a one-night-only event. No cameras, no press, a closed hall. They weren't asking her to perform. They were asking her to curate a night of silence. Evelyn read the invitation 3 times, then said yes. She chose the theme. What wasn't heard? She invited 5 musicians, none famous, all forgotten. Each performed a piece they were once told they weren't ready for. Evelyn herself did not play until the very end. Then barefoot, hair down, wearing no makeup, she walked to the piano. No speech, no program, just hands on keys. She played a single melody, a lullaby, simple, haunting, childlike. And as it ended, she whispered, "This is what I would have needed to hear when I was 17. Then she stood and left. Outside the hall, it was raining softly. Evelyn tilted her head back, let it soak her face, and for the first time in her life, she felt clean. Not washed from pain, but finally free from proving anything. She had become what they tried to erase, and she didn't need anyone's permission anymore. Later that night, Samuel sat beside her in a hotel room. They didn't speak, they just held hands. And somewhere between silence and sound the future was forming, not as a finale, but as a beginning. In the months to come, the Heart Institute would be replicated in 6 countries. A documentary titled She Played Anyway would win at Cannes. Stallman's estate would be auctioned and the proceeds donated anonymously to survivors of institutional abuse. A new law would be passed in Austria, guaranteeing artistic applicants the right to contest anonymous blacklisting. And a tiny satellite observatory would beam one of Evelyn's original compositions into space, just in case, the letter said, someone out there needs to hear that Earth had beauty too. One night, Evelyn sat again at the window of her Vienna flat, mug in hand, quiet city below. She opened her notebook, wrote just one line. When I stopped trying to be heard, I finally listened. She closed the book, smiled, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't need to play anything, because the world was already listening. The first scene opens not with Evelyn, but with a girl in Nigeria, about 12 years old, sitting cross-legged in a dusty schoolroom, headphones over her ears, eyes closed. The music playing is soft, Evelyn's lullaby from the Amsterdam concert. A teacher walks in. "Kioma, what are you listening to?" The girl opens her eyes. Someone who never gave up. The teacher smiles faintly, says nothing and lets her be. Thousands of miles away, in Buenos Aires, an elderly man in a black suit wheels a small piano into a public square. A sign dangles from it, for those who were silenced. He begins to play, slow, broken, beautiful. A crowd forms. Someone recognizes the tune. A melody Evelyn played in her greenhouse concert. When asked later who he was, he simply replies, "I once taught a girl." She never came back, but someone like her found her way. At the Heart Institute in Austria, Evelyn is not in the spotlight. She's in the background, reviewing a student's sheet music, coaching a shy baritone, making tea for the parents of a girl who just revealed she wants to quit music entirely. Evelyn listens, then says quietly, "You don't owe music anything. But if it still lives inside you, it might owe you." Later, Rosa calls her from a train. "Can you believe this? Iceland wants to start a heart center, and Chile, and Japan." "That's good. Evelyn says, washing dishes slowly. You sound distant. I'm listening. To what? Evelyn looks out the window. Whatever's next. It's Rosa who brings her a letter, hand-delivered. The envelope is expensive, thick paper, gold edging. The seal, Ministry of Culture, Austria. Evelyn opens it with steady hands. You are invited to accept the National Order of Merit for artistic contribution to social justice and cultural restoration. Should you accept, the ceremony will be broadcast live from the Vienna Opera House. She puts the letter down. Rosa watches her. Will you go? I don't know. Why not? I don't think I'm the right one. You're the reason I'm here. Evelyn smiles. But that doesn't mean I need a medal for it. 2 days later, a package arrives. Inside, a VHS tape. Label, Conservatory Archives 1999, Room 4B. There's no sender. Curious, Evelyn borrows a machine to play it. The screen flickers. A young girl appears. Her, 17. Playing the same Rachmaninoff piece that once silenced an entire room. But the camera doesn't stay on her hands. It lingers on her face. Focused, fierce, unapologetic. Evelyn sits still, watching her younger self. For the first time, she doesn't flinch. She rewinds, plays it again, not to remember, to witness. In an editorial the next week, a journalist writes, Evelyn Hart taught us that silence can be sacred, but it can also be a sentence. She turned it into a song, and in doing so, gave us all permission to make noise. The Institute receives an influx of letters from Bolivia, Pakistan, Finland, South Korea, Uganda. My daughter sings again. I found the courage to report my mentor. We started our own silent space. We call it Steel Room. I thought I was broken. Your music said I'm just bruised. Meanwhile, Stallman, in prison, is no longer the quiet, calculating figure he once was. Now he teaches a writing class. Every student is a former abuser. He never mentions Evelyn, but when asked what made him change, he says, I heard the last note. The interviewer is confused. What do you mean? He pauses. Not everyone gets a last note. She gave me mine. At the Vienna Opera House, preparations are underway. Red carpet, golden invitations, orchestra rehearsals. Evelyn has an RSPD. The Minister of Culture calls personally. We want the world to see who you are. I don't think I need that. But we do. Samuel finds her in the garden. She's pruning a jasmine vine. He leans against the doorway. They won't stop asking. I know. Why not go? You've earned it. She snips a branch. Do you think survivors should always become symbols? No. Do you think people hear better when the speaker is shining? Sometimes. But sometimes, the ones in the shadows speak louder. She looks at him. I'll go, but on my terms. She arrives late, wearing a plain black dress. No jewelry, no makeup. The audience rises. She does not bow. She walks to the center of the stage and faces the crowd. No notes, no speech in hand. She begins, I didn't come here to be celebrated. I came here because somewhere someone still believes they are too ruined to be heard. I was told that silence protects. It doesn't. It traps. It festers. But if you break it, even once, the sound echoes farther than you know. I'm not brave. I was just tired. Tired enough to risk playing truth. She steps back. A long pause. Then from the back of the room, someone begins to clap. Slow, respectful. Then another. And another. Not a standing ovation, just a rising one. And as Evelyn leaves the stage, she looks out at them and sees no faces. Just a sea of hands, clapping together. Outside, in the alley behind the opera house, a teenage girl with a cello case waits by the side door. She doesn't say anything when Evelyn exits. Just opens her case and hands her a folded note, then walks away. Evelyn reads it. I was going to quit today. I think I'll try one more time. Evelyn folds the note carefully, places it in her coat, and walks into the dark, not alone, but unburdened. As the camera pulls back, we see a child in Tokyo composing her first piano piece. a dancer in Johannesburg choreographing her silence, a composer in Montreal finishing a symphony called Survivor's Waltz, a music therapist in Gaza playing Evelyn's Amsterdam lullaby for children who have forgotten how to speak. In the final shot of the episode, Evelyn stands inside the Institute's performance space, empty. She sets a single candle on the piano, lights it, and begins to play a new piece, not written, improvised, and somewhere someone hears it. It started with a letter, typed, formal, from the European Council for Music and Ethics, inviting Evelyn to co-author a new charter, one that would redefine protections and accountability in music institutions across the continent. She stared at it. A part of her wanted to ignore it, but another voice inside her, not vengeful but resolved, whispered, "This is how it stops happening again." A few days later, she sat at a round table in Brussels, surrounded by ministers, policy advisors, educators, and artists. Some had once ignored her, some had been part of the same elite circle as Stallman, but now they leaned in. They listened. Because Evelyn didn't come with anger. She came with proof, a binder in her hands. She laid it down and opened it. Inside, testimonies from students who were silenced, anonymous quotes from faculty who turned a blind eye. Internal memos leaked after her story went viral. The room was dead quiet. "None of this is theory," Evelyn said. "It's structure. A structure that protects itself unless we dismantle it." One of the ministers, an older woman with stone glasses, leaned forward. "What do you propose?" Evelyn slid forward a second document. Title: The Heart Guidelines. By spring, the guidelines were being reviewed for adoption by conservatories in 9 countries. They included mandatory third-party reporting channels for misconduct, a registry of grant-related conflicts of interest, mental health support integrated into all music programs, and most radically, survivor-led curriculum panels. She refused to allow her name to be used for prestige. Instead, she added a line on the final page, "This document is not about me. It's about anyone who was told silence is survival." Back at the Institute, change was happening too. One afternoon, Evelyn arrived to find the front gates open and a group of children leading their parents through the halls. It wasn't a performance. It was Open Silence Day. The idea came from Malika, a shy 14-year-old cellist who had once refused to play in front of anyone. She had painted signs for the event. "Today, everyone gets to listen without explaining. You don't have to play to belong. Silence is not emptiness. It's space." Evelyn found Malika afterward, sitting cross-legged in the atrium, smiling quietly. "I didn't play," she said. "You didn't have to," Evelyn replied. One night, Samuel found Evelyn in the recording studio, her hands resting on a silent keyboard. "Writer's block?" he asked. "No," she said. "It's just, I don't know what to say that hasn't been said." He walked over, pressed one key. "Then say it again, but softer. People are still learning to hear." She nodded slowly, then started to play something new. That spring, something unexpected happened. A petition circulated online. It wasn't started by her team or her students or even her supporters. It was started by parents. "We want music education that doesn't reward obedience. We want music that teaches our children to stay whole. We want the heart method in every school." Within 2 weeks, it had 3.2 million signatures. Local governments began reaching out. Public schools asked for workshops. Evelyn was overwhelmed. She sat with Rosa in the garden, unsure. "I'm not an institution," she said. "I'm just recovering." Rosa smiled. "Then let's make something that helps people recover with you." They created the Still Sound curriculum, not rigid, not traditional, but resilient. It included essays on trauma-informed creativity, history of systemic silence in the arts, exercises in improvisation as emotional expression, and most importantly, the right not to perform. In April, Evelyn visited her childhood school, the one where her fingers first found keys. The hall was smaller than she remembered, the benches too close together, but the piano was still there. though older and with one broken pedal. She sat at it, ran her hands across the wood, then spoke to the sixth graders gathered before her. "You don't have to become a pianist," she said, "but if you ever feel like your silence is louder than your voice, remember, you can play it." One boy raised his hand. "What if nobody listens?" She smiled. "Play anyway." The next week, an unexpected message reached her inbox from Ingrid Stallman, Stallman's daughter. They had never spoken. The message was short. "I'm sorry for what my name meant in your life. I'd like to meet you, not to explain, just to listen, if you're willing." Evelyn stared at the screen for a long time. She didn't reply, not that day, not the next, but a week later she wrote, "I don't want your apology, but I accept your willingness. Let's meet, somewhere without pianos." They chose a small cafe in Vienna. No press, no entourage. They sat for 2 hours, mostly in silence, until Ingrid said softly, "My father never talked about it, but I remember. I found a program once. Your name was on it." Then it disappeared. Evelyn said nothing. "You know," Ingrid continued, "he always said talent was a commodity, something to own. I think he forgot that people aren't." Evelyn looked out the window. "There's nothing I can forgive, because it's not yours to carry." Ingrid nodded. "Thank you for saying yes." Evelyn stood, paused, then said, "I didn't say yes. I just said, not no." They parted without touching, and neither looked back. That summer, Evelyn's lullaby, the one from the Amsterdam concert, was adapted into a children's book, illustrated by a survivor of child trafficking who said it was the only music she could fall asleep to. The book was titled The Quietest Sound. Evelyn wept when she read it, not because of sadness, but because someone else was now telling the story, in their own way, with their own sound. In the final scene of this chapter, Evelyn sits at a kitchen table sipping tea. Outside, the Institute's courtyard is alive with activity. No cameras, no tours, just music, some quiet, some not. She opens her notebook and writes a single line, "A legacy is not what you leave behind. It's what keeps moving when you stop." She closes the notebook, listens, and smiles, because the word is finally playing in tune. The scene opens in a small prison in Lithuania. A former violin instructor, now in Maid, sits in a circle of chairs. Around him are other men, some weathered, some broken. They're watching a screen. On it, Evelyn's Vienna speech plays. When she says, "I was just tired enough to risk playing truth," the room falls silent. The guard in the back, who usually makes jokes, wipes his face with the sleeve. No one says anything for a full minute. Then the violinist murmurs, "We were always the ones playing over the silence." No one disagrees. In Washington, D.C., a bill is proposed. The Heart Reform Act. It isn't about music. It's about institutional transparency, particularly in grant-funded arts and education programs. It proposes a system of checks, background scrutiny for cultural patrons, and anonymous reporting for misconduct. The congresswoman who presents it speaks plainly. This isn't about one pianist. It's about a pattern. Evelyn Hart showed us the silence between notes. This bill ensures we never ignore those silences again. Back in Vienna, Evelyn walks alone near the Donau Canal. She wears sunglasses, a scarf, not to hide, but to observe. She sits on a bench and watches a group of teenagers playing music through a small speaker. She recognizes the piece. It's a remix, modern, electronic, of her Greenhouse concert melody. The rhythm is new, but the spine is hers. One of the teens looks over, doesn't recognize her. "Cool track, huh?" he says. She smiles. "Yes, very." And in that moment, she feels free. The Heart Institute expands, not with marble or staff, but chapters, quiet spaces springing up in rural Thailand, inner city Detroit, a girls' school in Kabul, a refugee camp in Jordan. Each space uses the same principles. Silence is honored, safety comes first, performance is a choice, and no one is asked to speak if they are not ready. Evelyn visits none of them at first. She lets others lead, but every week she receives a letter from a student, a teacher, or sometimes a stranger. Each one begins the same way. I thought I was the only one. One afternoon, Rosa finds Evelyn looking through old photo boxes. Are you okay? She asks. Evelyn holds up a torn picture. Her conservatory class. She's 17, eyes wide, future unspoiled. I used to want to burn all of this, Evelyn whispers. Now I want to archive it. Why the change? Because hiding it means it still owns me. Rosa puts a hand on her shoulder. I think you've already rewritten the ending. Evelyn smiles faintly. Number, I've just opened space for new ones. Meanwhile, Stallman's trial has become international news. Not just for his actions, but because others begin to fall. His case opens doors to a famous conductor in Prague, a conservatory director in Marseille, a philanthropist in Los Angeles. Each new revelation traces back to a shared pattern. Each time Evelyn's name appears in headlines, she sees nothing, but inside she feels a storm shifting course, no longer aimed at her, but at what allowed it all to happen. A documentary team asks for her participation. She refuses. I don't want to be consumed. I want to live. They understand. Instead, they interview others. Her students, critics, strangers moved by her music. The film is titled Sound After Silence. In it, a former art student says, "We didn't learn music. We learned how to breathe. It premieres at Sundance. It wins." Evelyn doesn't attend, but she watches it on a laptop, wrapped in a blanket, hand over her mouth, weeping softly. In a twist no one expected, a private music school in Munich is renamed the Evelyn Hart Academy for Artistic Integrity. It causes controversy. Critics argue she never sought the spotlight, but students push back. She didn't seek it, that's why she deserves it. In the middle of all this, Evelyn receives a personal invitation from the International Criminal Court, a new initiative aimed at documenting abuse in elite institutions worldwide wants her input, not just as a survivor, but as a systems observer. She flies to The Hague quietly, no press, just closed doors and long hours. She presents her findings, the mechanisms of grooming and mentorship structures, how reputation laundering silences truth, the role of unchecked philanthropy in protecting predators. One delegate, an older man from Brazil, leans back and says, "You've done more than survive. You've designed a blueprint for prevention." Evelyn doesn't reply, but she writes in her notebook that night, "Maybe justice doesn't sound like thunder. Maybe it sounds like instruction." Back at the institute, she finds something strange. A sealed envelope, no return address. Inside, a music score, handwritten, no name. But the handwriting is Stallman's. The piece is titled, "For the One I Couldn't Silence." Evelyn plays it once. It's broken, beautiful, unresolved. She plays it a second time and burns it, not in hate, but as ritual. In the next weeks, more stories come forward, not about pain but after pain. A young boy in Syria playing cello in bombed ruins. A survivor in Poland becoming the youngest conductor in her country. A blind girl in Manila composing music based only on memory. Each attributes their courage to a story, a woman, a truth, not because she told them, but because she didn't stop speaking when it hurt most. One day, Evelyn visits a tiny bookstore. The woman behind the counter recognizes her. "I don't mean to bother," she says nervously, "but do you mind signing this?" She holds out a book, not about Evelyn, but by her. A surprise publication, one Rosa compiled and submitted quietly. Notes, Between Silence, a collection of Evelyn's journal fragments, lecture lines, and annotations. Evelyn takes the book, flips through. Page 43 reads, "Silence is not empty. It is the sound of something waiting to be said." She signs it. "Thank you," the woman whispers. "I started playing again because of this." At the close of this chapter, we see Evelyn alone in her rehearsal room. There's no sheet music, no cameras, just her and a piano. She begins to play, slow, exploratory, unsure. It's not Rickman enough, not her lullaby, not anything known. A new melody, one with space and rest and breath and hope. As the notes rise, we fade out on her silhouette, head bowed, hands alive, no longer mourning, just becoming. It was autumn in Vienna, golden trees, thin rain, wind carrying leaves in small disorganized ballets. Evelyn spent most days in the attic of the institute, not teaching, not performing, just listening. Sometimes to music, sometimes to nothing. The attic was bare, a rug, a window, a kettle, and a battered upright piano that went out of tune every time the temperature dropped. She liked it that way. When asked to give a TED talk, she declined. When offered a memoir deal, she refused. "I'm not finished yet," she told Rosa. "I'm still unfolding." One morning, Evelyn found a small envelope under her door. Inside, a folded piece of paper and a dried lavender sprig. The letter read, "In April, Evelyn visited her childhood school, the one where her fingers first found keys. The hall was smaller than she remembered, the benches too close together, but the piano was still there, though older and with one broken pedal. She sat at it, ran her hands across the wood, then spoke to the sixth graders gathered before her. 'You don't have to become a pianist,' she said, 'but if you ever feel like your silence is louder than your voice, remember, you can play it.' One boy raised his hand. 'What if nobody listens?' She smiled. 'Play anyway.' The next week, an unexpected message reached her inbox from Ingrid Stallman, Stallman's daughter. They had never spoken. The message was short. "I'm sorry for what my name meant in your life. I'd like to meet you, not to explain, just to listen, if you're willing." Evelyn stared at the screen for a long time. She didn't reply, not that day, not the next, but a week later she wrote, "I don't want your apology, but I accept your willingness. Let's meet, somewhere without pianos." They chose a small cafe in Vienna. No press, no entourage. They sat for 2 hours, mostly in silence, until Ingrid said softly, "My father never talked about it, but I remember I found a program once. Your name was on it. Then it disappeared." Evelyn said nothing. "You know," Ingrid continued, "he always said talent was a commodity, something to own. I think he forgot that people aren't." Evelyn looked out the window. "There's nothing I can forgive, because it's not yours to carry." Ingrid nodded. "Thank you for saying yes." Evelyn stood, paused, then said, "I didn't say yes. I just said not no." They parted without touching, and neither looked back. That summer, Evelyn's lullaby, the one from the Amsterdam concert, was adapted into a children's book, illustrated by a survivor of child trafficking who said it was the only music she could fall asleep to. The book was titled The Quietest Sound. Evelyn wept when she read it, not because of sadness, but because someone else was now telling the story, in their own way, with their own sound. In the final scene of this chapter, Evelyn sits at a kitchen table sipping tea. Outside, the Institute's courtyard is alive with activity. No cameras, no tours, just music, some quiet, some not. She opens her notebook and writes a single line, "A legacy is not what you leave behind. It's what keeps moving when you stop." She closes the notebook, listens, and smiles, because the word is finally playing in tune. The scene opens in a small prison in Lithuania. A former violin instructor, now in Maid, sits in a circle of chairs. Around him are other men, some weathered, some broken. They are watching a screen. On it, Evelyn's Vienna speech plays. When she says, "I was just tired enough to risk playing truth," the room falls silent. The guard in the back, who usually makes jokes, wipes his face with the sleeve. No one says anything for a full minute. Then the violinist murmurs, "We were always the ones playing over the silence." No one disagrees. In Washington, D.C., a bill is proposed. The Heart Reform Act. It isn't about music. It's about institutional transparency, particularly in grant-funded arts and education programs. It proposes a system of checks, background scrutiny for cultural patrons, and anonymous reporting for misconduct. The congresswoman who presents it speaks plainly. This isn't about one pianist, it's about a pattern. Evelyn Hart showed us the silence between notes. This bill ensures we never ignore those silences again. Back in Vienna, Evelyn walks alone near the Donau Canal. She wears sunglasses, a scarf, not to hide, but to observe. She sits on a bench and watches a group of teenagers playing music through a small speaker. She recognizes the piece. It's a remix, modern, electronic, of her Greenhouse concert melody. The rhythm is new, but the spine is hers. One of the teens looks over, doesn't recognize her. "Cool track, huh?" he says. She smiles. "Yes, very." And in that moment, she feels free. The Hart Institute expands. Not with marble or stuff, but chapters, quiet spaces springing up in rural Thailand, inner city Detroit, a girls' school in Kabul, a refugee camp in Jordan. Each space uses the same principles. Silence is honored, safety comes first, performance is a choice, and no one is asked to speak if they are not ready. Evelyn visits none of them at first. She lets others lead, but every week she receives a letter from a student, a teacher, or sometimes a stranger. Each one begins the same way. "I thought I was the only one." One afternoon, Rosa finds Evelyn looking through old photo boxes. "Are you okay?" she asks. Spring in Vienna blooms soft and early. Light spills into the cobbled streets like liquid gold. Cherry blossoms open on trees Evelyn used to walk past on the way to the conservatory, once with hope, once with grief, now with stillness. A stillness that doesn't mean numbness, it means peace. The Hart Institute continues to grow, not in size but in reach. A sister location opens in Chile, another in Kenya. They all follow the same blueprint. No applause, no pressure, no judgment, only music and silence, in equal measure. Evelyn doesn't attend ribbon cuttings or gala dinners. Instead, she visits anonymously, sometimes as a volunteer janitor, other times as a silent observer in the back of the room. Once, in a remote part of Iceland, a girl recognizes her. Evelyn presses a finger to her lips, not asking for secrecy, but inviting her into the sacredness of silence. The girl nods and says nothing. Meanwhile, Stallman's trial ends. The court finds him guilty on multiple charges: financial manipulation, coercion, abuse of power. But it is the cultural verdict that carries weight. He has become a symbol, not of evil, but of complacency. A name spoken not with rage, but as a warning. And yet Evelyn doesn't celebrate. When Rosa brings her the news, Evelyn simply says, "Good. Now we can stop saying his name." She spends more time in nature, learns to garden, tends to roses, lavender, thyme. She likes things that take time. She likes watching something heal. And in one corner of her modest backyard, she builds something new. A greenhouse stage, not for concerts, but for moments. Moments when students feel ready. When their pain has learned to speak through sound. Not always beautiful, but always honest. Letters keep arriving, some from strangers, some from names she thought she'd never hear again. One morning, she receives a letter that makes her stop mid-step. It's from the daughter of her old rival, the pianist who replaced her in the conservatory showcase all those years ago. The letter reads, "She died last year. But she asked me to tell you something. You were the better player. I just had better protection. I'm sorry." Evelyn doesn't cry, but she writes back, "No need to be sorry. We were all survivors. Some just didn't know it yet." At the Institute's 5-year anniversary, Evelyn gives a speech. It's her first public address since the concert in Leipzig. The hall is modest. The crowd is mixed. Artists, students, activists, caretakers, survivors. She steps to the podium, takes a breath and says, "I used to believe music could save me. Now I know it can't. But it can remind me I'm worth saving. And that's enough." She doesn't speak for long. She doesn't need to. Silence follows, and it is the loudest applause she's ever known. One day, Evelyn walks through Vienna's music district and sees a street performer playing the Rachmaninoff piece, the one from the night of her reckoning. The crowd is large. They don't know the story, but the music knows. She listens for a while, then leaves money in the case. No signature, no explanation, just gratitude. At home, she keeps a small box. Inside, the lavender sprig, the letter from Lena, the burned corner of Stallman's music sheet, and a single newspaper clipping from the first article that named her. She played truth. She opens it once a year, on the anniversary of the night she first played again. Then she closes it and puts it away, because she lives forward, not backward. One afternoon, Rosa finds her in the garden, eyes closed, face in the sun. "Where are you today?" she asks. Evelyn smiles. "In the future." Rosa tilts her head. "And what does it sound like?" Evelyn thinks for a long moment, then answers, "Like breath, like forgiveness, like a child playing a wrong note and no one correcting them." The final scene unfolds quietly. Evelyn walks into a concert hall, empty, dusk. She steps onto the stage, alone. No program, no announcement, just her and the grand piano. She sits, places her hands on the keys, breathes. She doesn't play Rachmaninoff. She doesn't play any composer known to the world. She plays her own piece, something new, something built from every silence she ever survived. It begins low, almost inaudible. Then it rises, not loud, but certain. Each note speaks without shame. The melody is not beautiful by traditional standards. It bends, it pauses, it falters, but it tells the truth. And truth, at last, has no need for perfection. The camera pulls back, out of the hall, into the city, into the world. A voice, not narrated but remembered, echoes as the music continues. Some people play to be heard. I played so others could speak. Fade to black. Then a final line appears, dedicated to the voices still finding their way to sound.